She stepped off the train into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just a platform made of warped timber, 11 cents in her pocket, and a letter full of promises that turned out to be lies. The man who wrote it was gone. The town did not care, and the mountains surrounding her did not care either. But what Emmeline Pardo did not know, standing alone on that platform with everything she owned in a single trunk, was that three men were coming. Three brothers built like the mountains themselves, hiding a fortune and a secret that would change her life in ways no letter could ever have promised. This is that story. The letter had promised a man named Leland Goss. It described him as steady, patient, and ready for a wife who understood that mountain life asked more than it gave back. Emmeline Pardo had read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold lines, the ink slightly smeared, where her thumb always rested when she reached the part about the house he was building. A real house he had written with a proper kitchen and a porch that faces the morning sun. She had believed every word of it. She had needed to believe it the way a person standing at the edge of something needs to believe there is ground on the other side. Leland Goss was not at the station when the train pulled into Flint Hollow, Montana territory on a cold September afternoon in 1878. He was not at the post office either, or the general store, or anywhere along the short stretch of packed dirt that passed for a main street in this town that barely qualified as a town at all. Emmeline stood on the platform, which was nothing more than a few planks of warped timber laid across mud, with a single trunk and a hat the wind immediately decided it did not respect. And she waited. An hour passed, then another. The station admirer, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had worn a groove in his face, finally told her plainly. Leland Goss had left Flint Hollow nearly a month prior. No forwarding address, no word left behind for anyone. Least of all for the woman he had written to, courted through letters, and sent a train ticket to join him in a place she had never seen. Emmeline did not cry. She had learned early in life that crying required an audience willing to be moved, and the station master had already gone back inside, pulling the door shut behind him, with the flat indifference of a man whose job was trains not people. She stood on that platform alone for another few minutes, watching the train pull away south along the valley floor, the engine smoke dissolving into a sky so wide it made her feel like something that could be erased. It was as though the train were taking the last reasonable version of her future with it, carrying it back down the mountain to a world where promises on paper still meant something. Then she picked up her trunk, settled her hat against the wind with one firm hand, and walked toward town. If you could call it that, Flint Hollow in September of 1878 was a place that existed more out of stubbornness than planning. A dozen buildings lined the main road, most of them timber-framed and weather-beaten, leaning slightly into the prevailing wind like old men who had given up standing straight. There was a general store with a porch that sagged in the middle, a blacksmith shop that smelled of coal and iron even from across the street, a saloon with no name on it, just a painted bottle on a board above the door, which told you everything you needed to know about the ambitions of the place. Beyond the buildings, the mountains rose in every direction, not gently, not like hills that suggest themselves and leave room for argument. These mountains rose like walls, dark with pine and spruce, their upper ridges already dusted with the first early snow of a season that had not technically arrived but clearly intended to. The air was thinner here than Emmy was used to, and colder, and it carried the smell of wood smoke and pine sap, and something else she could not name, but would later come to recognize as the scent of a place that did not care whether you survived it. She had come from Missouri. Her mother had died when Emmy was 17. A frontier woman in spirit, if not in geography, her mother had taught her everything that mattered, and almost nothing that polite society considered essential. She could dress a wound before she could arrange flowers. She could read by lamplight and mend a torn seam and make soup from almost nothing, because her mother had believed that a woman who could not feed herself was a woman who could be controlled, and she had no intention of raising that kind of daughter. Her father had followed 2 years later, passing quietly in his chair one evening in a way that seemed, even at the time, entirely consistent with how he had lived. Quietly, without fuss, without bothering anyone about it. He left behind a small inheritance that went to practical things: rent, food, a winter coat. And then when the practical things ran out, a train ticket west purchased, with the last of it in response to an advertisement in a newspaper that Emmy had read by the light of a kerosene lamp in an empty house that no longer felt like hers. She was 22 years old. She had never been courted, never been kissed, never been held by anyone other than her mother, and that had ended 5 years ago, in a room that smelled of lavender and camphor and the stillness that follows a last breath. She had told Leland Goss all of this in her letters plainly and without apology because she believed that a life built on pretense was a life built on sand. She had come to Montana not merely as a bride, but as a woman who had never belonged anywhere and was looking for a place to finally put down roots. And the place had rejected her before she even arrived. But Emmy Pardo was not a woman who stood still for long, when standing still served no purpose. She had 11 cents in her pocket, a trunk full of clothes suited for a rancher's wife that were practical enough, but not much use to a woman suddenly and completely on her own, and a decision to make. She could spend her last coins trying to send a telegram to no one in particular, asking for help that would not come. Or she could walk into town and find a way to survive until she figured out what surviving looked like from here. She walked into town. She found work the same afternoon. Ida Calhoun ran the only boarding house in Flint Hollow and had the gift of reading a person's situation without making them feel red. She was a wide woman, built the way women are built when they have spent 30 years lifting cast iron pots and kneading bread dough and hauling water from a well that was always a little farther than it should have been. Her hands were strong and rough. Her eyes held a permanent squint from decades of working near hot stoves and reading small print in bad light. She was somewhere around 55, though she carried her age the way a good oak table carries its years, with the kind of wear that makes a thing more solid rather than less. She was also, Emmy would learn, a woman with a soft spot for people in obvious trouble that she disguised so thoroughly as practicality that most people never noticed it at all. She looked at Emmy standing in her doorway with her dusty traveling dress and her single trunk, and her chin lifted at that angle that said everything about what she was feeling and nothing about whether she intended to let it show. And Ida Calhoun made a decision in approximately 4 seconds that would change the course of both their lives, though neither of them knew it at the time. She offered Emmy a small room at the back of the house, 3 meals a day, a modest wage in exchange for cooking, cleaning, and managing the needs of whoever happened to be staying. The work was honest, she said, and the hours were long, and she did not tolerate complaint or self-pity, but she kept a clean house and a fair ledger, and she had never once failed to pay what she owed. Emmy accepted without negotiation. That had been 6 weeks ago. By the time October settled cold and golden over Flint Hollow, Emmy had learned Ida's boarding house the way you learn a piece of music, not by reading it, but by playing it until your hands remember without being told. She knew which floorboard creaked outside room 4, and which window stuck in the cold, and which chair at the dining table had a leg that wobbled unless you put the folded piece of cardboard under it. Just so, she knew Mr. Aldridge in room 2 took his coffee without sugar and his pride without question, and that he would rather sit with an empty cup than ask for more. She knew the wind came hard from the north just before dawn and rattled the kitchen window in a way that sounded, if you were still half asleep, almost like someone knocking to be let in. The work was honest, the days were full, and Emmy told herself that was enough. Most mornings she believed it. But what she had not resolved, what lived quietly at the back of her mind, like an unanswered letter sitting on a desk, was the question of what came next. Flint Hollow was not where she had imagined her life settling. It was the kind of town that felt temporary even to people who had lived there 20 years. A place men passed through more often than they stayed in. And Emmy had always believed, perhaps foolishly, that she was meant to stay somewhere, to build something that lasted, to belong to a place the way a tree belongs to the ground. Not by force, but by root. She just had not found that place yet. And at 22, with no family left to return to and no clear road forward, that uncertainty sat heavier some evenings than others. She would stand on the back porch of the boarding house after supper was cleared and the other guests had retreated to their rooms, and she would look west toward the mountains, where the last light caught the snow on the highest peaks and turned it gold, and she would feel something that was not quite sadness and not quite hope, but something in between that had no name she knew of. She had almost entirely stopped thinking about Leland Goss. Almost. It was a Tuesday evening when they brought Sawyer Drummond in. 2 men carried him through the front door just as Emmy was laying the supper table, and the way they were carrying him told her immediately that this was not drink. One arm draped over each of their shoulders, his boot heels dragging parallel lines in the floorboards. his head hanging forward with the heavy stillness of a body that had used up everything it had. Drunk men protested being carried. They had opinions about it. They argued and cursed and tried to stand when standing was the last thing they were capable of. This man was silent in the way of someone whose body had made all the decisions and left his mind with nothing left to manage. But it was not one man being carried by two strangers. It was one man being carried by two men who looked almost exactly like him. All three of them filled the doorway the way mountains fill a horizon, tall in a way that went past ordinary tallness and into something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Broad-shouldered, long-limbed, heavy with the kind of muscle that comes not from vanity, but from years of swinging axes and hauling timber and wrestling cattle in weather that would break most men before breakfast. They had the same square jaw, the same high, sharp cheekbones, the same amber-colored eyes that caught the lamplight and held it. But each of them wore those features differently, the way three instruments can play the same note and still sound nothing alike. The man being carried, the one who was hurt, had chestnut brown hair, matted with sweat and dust, and a face that held an expression of command even while he was barely conscious. There was an old scar along his left shoulder, faded to silver, that looked like it had been put there by something moving very fast a long time ago. He was the one Emmy would later learn was named Sawyer. The eldest of the three by minutes, though the word eldest seemed to carry more weight with him than minutes should allow. The man on the left, supporting Sawyer's arm with a grip that was firm but careful, had dark blonde hair and the quietest eyes Emmy had ever seen. He did not speak a single word as he came through the door. He simply looked around the room, once slowly cataloging everything with the unhurried precision of a man who trusted his eyes more than his ears, and then his gaze settled on Emmy. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked at her with the steady, unreadable expression of someone filing away information he had not yet decided what to do with. That was Nolan. The man on the right was the tallest of the three, standing what must have been 6 feet and 8 inches, with auburn hair that was longer and wilder than his brother's, as though he had made a philosophical decision at some point to stop fighting it. He had a grin that seemed to live permanently on his face, regardless of circumstances, including the present circumstance of hauling a bleeding man through a boarding house door. He was the one who spoke first. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Ida, who had appeared from the kitchen with the calm efficiency of a woman who had seen most things at least twice. "You got a room open?" "My brother here ran into a bit of trouble." Ida looked at the three of them once. Then she looked at Emmy. "Room 3, she said. Nothing more was needed. Emmy had not trained as a nurse. What she knew about tending wounds she had learned from her mother, who had learned it from necessity, the way most frontier women learn most things. She knew to clean a wound before dressing it. She knew that infection announced itself through heat and smell long before it showed in color. She knew that a man in genuine pain would often insist he felt fine, and that you had to watch his hands rather than listen to his words to understand the truth of it. Sawyer Drummond's hands, when she cleaned the wound along his left side that first night, were completely still. That surprised her. Most men gripped something when they were hurting: a bedpost, a fistful of blanket, their own knee. They held on to something solid, as though pain were a current that might carry them away if they did not anchor themselves to the physical world. Sawyer simply lay with his hands open at his sides, palms up, staring at the ceiling with eyes that were focused and clear, despite whatever his body was enduring. He breathed slowly and deliberately through the cleaning, through the application of the stinging tincture Ida kept in the medicine cabinet, through the careful pressing of clean cloth against torn skin. He did not flinch. He did not grip. He simply endured it with his hands open and his breathing steady, and his jaw set in a way that told Emmy more about this man than any introduction could have. This was someone who had learned a long time ago that control was the only thing no one could take from you. Nolan and Beckett stood in the doorway of room 3 the entire time she worked, their combined shoulders filling the frame so completely that the hallway behind them disappeared. They watched without speaking, Nolan with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Beckett with his hat in his hands, his grin temporarily retired, his eyes sharp and watchful beneath the easy exterior. "This will need several days to close properly," Emmy told Sawyer, keeping her voice even and professional as she wrapped the final bandage. "I know," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, and it came out unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. It was the voice of a man who said things once and expected them to be heard. "Is there family I should send word to?" A pause followed. not the pause of a man searching for an answer, the pause of a man deciding exactly how much of an answer to offer. My family is right here, he said. And his eyes moved briefly to the doorway to the two men standing there like sentinels before returning to the ceiling. Emmy finished the dressing. She washed her hands in the basin by the window, dried them on a clean cloth, and moved toward the door. She nodded to Nolan and Beckett as she passed. Nolan stepped aside without a word. Beckett gave her a small nod that somehow contained both gratitude and appraisal. She left Sawyer to sleep, but she stood in the hallway outside room 3 a moment longer than the task required, her hand resting on the doorframe, her mind turning over that pause. There had been something in it, something that felt less like a simple answer and considerably more like a door being pulled carefully, quietly shut. And behind that door, she suspected there was a great deal more than a man with a wound on his left side and two brothers who looked like they had been carved from the same mountain. Over the following 3 days, Emmy began to learn the differences between the Drummond brothers, the way a person learns the differences between instruments in an orchestra, not just by sight, but by the distinct way each of them occupied space in the silence and the hours of a day. Sawyer, confined to bed, said very little and observed a great deal. Emmy noticed this because she was by nature the same kind of person. She recognized it the way you sometimes recognize in another person a habit you have never had a name for in yourself. He watched the room when she brought his meals. He watched the window and whatever moved beyond it, the changing color of the sky, the way the wind shifted the trees, the occasional passage of someone along the street below. And he watched her hands when she changed his dressing. Not in any way that made her uncomfortable, but with the focused, quiet attention of a man who cataloged details out of long habit, the way a hunter tracks movement, not because he intends to act on it, but because noticing things is simply what his mind does when left to its own devices. On the third morning, without any lead-up, he said, "You are not from here." "No," Emmy said, smoothing the edge of the fresh bandage with careful fingers. "Missouri, originally." She glanced up. "You—" His pause was shorter this time, but still deliberate, still considered. "West of here," he said. It was, she would think later, almost certainly true. It was also one of the most carefully constructed non-answers she had ever been handed. Truthful enough to satisfy, vague enough to reveal nothing. Like a fence built just high enough that you could not see over it, but not so high that you felt compelled to try. Nolan was different. He did not talk to Emmy. He talked to the boarding house itself through the language of repair. On the second morning, Emmy came into the kitchen before dawn and found that the window above the wash basin, the one that had rattled in the north wind every morning for the 6 weeks she had been there, no longer rattled. The hinge had been replaced. The frame had been shimmed with a thin piece of cedar that had been planed smooth and fitted so precisely it was nearly invisible. No one had asked for this. No one had mentioned it. She would not have known who had done it at all if she had not seen the cedar shavings in the bin outside and recognized them from the small knife Nolan carried in his belt. When she thanked him that afternoon, he nodded once. A single economical movement. As though words were a currency he saved very carefully and spent only when the exchange was certain to be worth it. But she caught Nolan looking at her twice during those first days. Not the furtive look of a man who did not want to be noticed looking. Something more considered than that. The contemplative gaze of a person trying to understand a puzzle he was not entirely sure he had the right to solve. Both times when she met his eyes, he did not look away. He simply held her gaze for a moment with those quiet amber eyes, and then returned to whatever he had been doing as though the looking had been its own complete action, requiring no follow-up and no explanation. Beckett was the easiest to know and the hardest to read because those two things are not the same thing at all. He talked to Ida as though they had known each other for 20 years, drawing her into conversations about everything from the best method for smoking venison to the stubbornness of Montana mud. He helped Emmy carry firewood in from the pile, without being asked, stacking it by the kitchen stove with an efficiency that suggested long practice. He made Mr. Aldridge, who spoke to almost no one about almost nothing, laugh out loud at the supper table with a story about a mule and a river crossing that may or may not have been true, but was told with such conviction that the truth of it became irrelevant. Beckett was warmth and noise and easy laughter, and he filled every room he entered the way a fire fills a hearth. And Emmy liked him instinctively the way most people did. But she also noticed something that took longer to see. When Beckett was talking, when his voice was filling the room and his grin was drawing everyone's attention, no one was looking at Sawyer. No one was watching Nolan. The room's focus was on the charming brother, the loud one, the one who made you feel at ease and asked nothing of you in return. And in the space that created in the blind spot of Beckett's considerable charisma, the other two brothers moved unobserved. Beckett was not merely friendly, he was a shield made of warmth. A distraction so well constructed, it felt like generosity. The question was what he was protecting them from. And the answer to that question Emmy suspected was the same answer that lived behind every one of Sawyer's careful pauses and Nolan's deliberate silences. On the fourth evening, Emmy brought Sawyer his supper and found him sitting up for the first time. His back was against the headboard, and he was watching the last of the daylight go slow and amber through the window, painting the rooftops of Flint Hollow in colors that made the shabby little town look for a few minutes almost beautiful. He looked better. The color had returned to his face, and the tightness around his eyes had eased into something closer to genuine rest. He was still not a man anyone would call relaxed, but he was no longer a man whose body was actively fighting to hold itself together. "You will be able to move around tomorrow," Emmy said, setting the tray on the side table carefully. "Thank you," he said. And then after a beat of silence that felt intentional rather than empty, he added, "For all of it." People said those words often enough that they had worn smooth with use like river stones that had been tumbled so long they no longer had edges. Thank you for everything. People said it when they were uncomfortable or when they wanted to end a conversation or when they could not think of anything more specific. But Sawyer Drummond said it the way a person says something they have been holding for several days, turning it over quietly, making certain they meant it before letting it go. Emmy nodded. She moved toward the door. "Miss Pardo." She stopped. She had introduced herself only as Emmy on the first night when her hands were busy and her attention was on the wound, and names had seemed like the least important thing in the room. She turned slowly. "Ida mentioned it," he said, reading her expression before she could arrange it. "I was not prying. I just wanted you to know that." Emmy looked at him for a moment. This quiet, careful man who had offered almost nothing about himself and yet had gone out of his way to explain that he had not been gathering information about her. "I did not think you were," she said, and she meant it. She left him to his supper. But in the hallway she paused again, her fingers resting lightly against the wall. The wood was cool beneath her hand, and the house was quiet around her in the way it always got at this hour when the day's work was done and the evening had not yet decided what it wanted to be. A man that deliberate about how he was perceived was either concealing something or he had been misjudged enough times that honesty had become a kind of armor he wore out of self-preservation rather than virtue. She did not know which was true. She was not entirely certain it mattered yet. But standing there in that quiet hallway with the day going dark around her, Emmeline Pardo realized she wanted to find out. That wanting unhurried and unasked for and entirely unexpected was the most present she had felt since stepping off that train 6 weeks ago with 11 cents a worn letter in a future that had vanished before she ever arrived to claim it. Several days passed, and then Ward Colton came to town. He walked into Ida's boarding house on a Thursday afternoon, and everything about him was wrong for Flint Hollow. His suit was too clean, his boots were too polished, his smile was too wide and too practiced, and it never once reached his eyes, which were the flat gray color of creek stones and held about the same warmth. He was perhaps 45 with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of face that had learned very early how to arrange itself into whatever expression a situation required. He asked Ida about 3 tall men, brothers, he said. Word was they had come through recently. Ida, standing behind her counter with her arms crossed and her permanent squint narrowed to something approaching hostility, told him she did not know who he was talking about. Colton did not press. He simply smiled that wide, empty smile, set a small card on the counter, and walked back out into the autumn afternoon, as though the entire visit had been nothing more than a social call. Emmy was drying dishes by the kitchen window when she saw Beckett stand up from the porch chair where he had been sitting. He had seen Colton pass. And the grin, the permanent easy room filling grin, that Emmy had come to think of as simply part of Beckett's face was gone. Completely gone. In its place was something cold and watchful and very, very still. He looked like a different man. He looked like a man who had just seen something he had been expecting to see and hoping he would not. He watched Colton until the man turned the corner at the end of the street. Then he went inside, straight to room 3. The door closed, and through the thin walls, Emmy could hear the low rumble of voice, urgent and tight, though too quiet to make out the words. She walked to the counter and picked up the card Colton had left. Ward Colton. Representative, First Mountain Bank and Trust. She set it back down. But the word bank sat in the back of her mind for the rest of the afternoon, quiet and unresolved. And it sat there through supper and through the washing up and through the Mons quiet evening when the boarding house settled into its familiar sounds. And Emmy stood on the back porch with her tea going cold, turning the card's words over in her mind, the way she turned everything over carefully and from every angle. Because Emmy Pardo had learned something in her 22 years that most people did not learn until they were much older. She had learned that the things people do not say are almost always more important than the things they do. And in this boarding house, in this small, stubborn town at the foot of these enormous, indifferent mountains, 3 men who looked like they could move the earth with their bare hands were not saying very much at all. And a man in a clean suit with a dead smile had come looking for them. And somewhere west of here, there was land, and a deed, and a secret that was worth riding a very long way to protect. She did not know what it was yet, but she was going to find out. That same evening after supper had been cleared and Mr. Aldridge had retired to room 2 with his empty coffee cup and his silence, Sawyer Drummond found Emmy on the back porch. She was sitting on the top step with her tea going cold in her hands, watching the last light leave the sky in long horizontal strips of orange and gray that looked like something a painter would attempt and fail to get right. The mountains to the west were going dark from the bottom up, the valleys filling with shadow, while the peaks still held the last of the day like a thing they were reluctant to release. He came out quietly. He stood at the edge of the porch, one hand resting on the post, and looked out at the same sky. He was moving better now. The wound still pulled at him. She could see it in the careful way he held his left side, but the worst of it had passed. He stood the way he did everything, deliberately, without waste. For a while, neither of them said anything. The silence between them had changed over the past several days. It had started as the silence of strangers, cautious and measured. Now it was something else. Not comfortable exactly, but no longer uncomfortable. The silence of 2 people who had recognized something in each other that did not require words to acknowledge. "I owe you an explanation," he said at last. "You don't," Emmy said. "Not to me." "Maybe not." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "But I would like to offer one anyway." She waited. "My brothers and I grew up on a ranch," he said, "west of here, large spread, been in my family a long time." He said it plainly, without pride or apology, the way a man states a fact about the weather or the distance between 2 towns. It was simply true, and he offered it at bond. "My father passed 2 years ago, left the ranch to the 3 of us, equal share." He stopped, chose his next words with the careful deliberation she had come to recognize as fundamental to who he was. "The 3 of us do not agree on much," he said, "have not for a long time. After my father's funeral, things were said that could not be unsaid." He paused again, and this time the pause was longer, and Emmy could feel the weight of it in the cooling evening air. Whatever had been said at that funeral had left marks deeper than the wound on his side. "Between you and Nolan," Emmy said quietly. Sawyer looked at her. It was the first time she had used either of his brothers' names, and the fact that she had guessed correctly which brother the conflict was with told him something about how carefully she had been paying attention. "Yes," he said, "between me and Nolan. Beckett got caught in the middle. Always has." He told her then in the spare and measured way he told everything about the argument, about the things said over a freshly filled grave that should never have been said at all, but that grief has a way of dragging out of people like a river drags stones from the bottom. Sawyer had wanted to keep the ranch, expand it, build it into something their father would have been proud of. Nolan had wanted to leave, not because he hated the land, but because the weight of it, the expectation of it, the way their father had run it with an iron grip and a rigid certainty that left no room for a different kind of man, had become something Nolan could no longer carry. And Beckett, the youngest by minutes, the one with the easy grin and the loud laugh, and the warmth that made strangers feel like friends, had stood between his 2 brothers and been unable to choose. "I called Nolan a traitor," Sawyer said. "Said he was abandoning everything our father built, everything our mother died believing in." Emmy heard the word mother and filed it away. She did not ask. There would be a time for that. Nolan said I was turning into our father, Sawyer continued. Said I was the same kind of man. Hard, unbending, too proud to see what I was doing to the people around me. Was he right? The question came out before Emmy had fully decided to ask it. It hung in the air between them, direct and unadorned, and she half expected him to deflect it, the way he deflected most things, with a careful pause and a partial answer that satisfied without revealing. But he did not deflect. Partly, he said, and the honesty of it, the way he said it without flinching, made Emmy understand something about Sawyer Drummond that she had not fully grasped until that moment. He was not a man who hid from the truth. He was a man who revealed it slowly, deliberately, one piece at a time, and only when he believed the person he was speaking to could be trusted to hold it without breaking it. I walked away, he said. Thought distance would settle things. I took Beckett with me because I needed at least one person I could trust beside me. Nolan stayed on the ranch alone. Alone, Emmy repeated. 2 years, Sawyer said, and the weight of those 2 words was heavier than anything else he had said that evening. Did the distance settle it? No. It just moved the problem further down the road. And now the road has caught up, seems that way. The sky had gone deep blue at its edges, the first stars showing faint and uncertain above the mountains. Somewhere down the street, a door closed, and a dog barked twice and went quiet. The wind had died down, and the evening was still in that way that mountain evenings get still, as though the whole world were holding its breath. Can I ask you something? Emmy said. Yes. Do you want to go back? The question landed between them and stayed there. Sawyer did not answer immediately. He looked out at the darkening street, and his jaw set in the way of someone sorting through something complicated, something with too many edges and not enough flat surfaces to set it down on. Part of me does, he said finally, the part that remembers what it felt like before everything went wrong. He paused. The rest of me is not sure that part can be trusted. Emmy considered that for a moment, turning her cup slowly between her palms. That sounds like a man who still cares about something he has been pretending not to care about, she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. The look of a person who has been accurately described by someone who had no obvious reason to see them that clearly. You are perceptive, he said. I've had time to practice, she replied. Being overlooked gives you that. It came out before she had decided to say it. She had not intended to reveal that much, but the evening and the quiet and the honesty of the conversation had loosened something she usually kept fastened. She did not look at him when it landed, but Sawyer turned toward her slowly. And when she finally glanced up, he was not wearing the polite expression she expected. He was looking at her the way he looked at everything, with that steady, unhurried attention, as though what she had just said mattered enough to be received properly. Whoever left you standing on that platform, he said, and his voice was careful and low as a fool. Emmy felt something shift in her chest, small and quiet, like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. She looked back at the stars rather than at him. Maybe, she said softly, or maybe it worked out the way it was supposed to. It was on a quiet Saturday afternoon, 12 days after the Drummond brothers had arrived, that the first thread began to loosen. Emmy was mending a tear in one of the curtains from room 2, sitting by the window in the front parlor, where the light was best, when a man she did not recognize came through the front door of the boarding house without knocking. He was broad-shouldered, trail dusty, and wearing the expression of someone who had ridden a long way with a specific purpose. He looked around the front room slowly, and then his eyes landed on Sawyer, who was sitting near the window reading a newspaper he had folded to a precise quarter size. Something shifted in the stranger's expression. A quick flash of recognition followed almost immediately by relief. Drummond, he said. Sawyer lowered the newspaper with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had heard his name said in that tone before and had decided some time ago not to let it move him. Dillard, he said. Emmy kept her eyes on the curtain in her lap, but her hands had gone still. Dillard crossed the room and sat across from Sawyer without being offered a seat. He was quiet for a moment, working the brim of his hat between his fingers. The bank sent a final notice, he said low enough that Emmy might not have caught it if the room had not been so quiet. They need signatures from all 3 of you before the 1st of January, 1879. If they do not have them, Colton considers the claim abandoned. He has a buyer lined up already. Nolan appeared in the hallway. Emmy had not heard him approach, which was typical of Nolan, who moved through the world with the silent precision of a man who had learned that being noticed was not always an advantage. He stood with his back against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, his face giving nothing away. Beckett came in from the front porch. His grin was back, but it was harder than usual, set in place like a mask, rather than something that lived naturally on his face. "Tell Colton we will think about it," Beckett said. His voice was light, but there was nothing light in it. Dillard looked at all three brothers in turn. He nodded once, stood, and left without another word. The front door closed behind him, and the room settled back into its ordinary quiet. Three brothers looked at each other. It was a conversation conducted entirely without words, the kind of communication that only exists between people who have known each other since before memory begins, and Emmy watched it happen from behind her curtain and understood that whatever was being decided in those few seconds of silence was something that had been building for much longer than she had been present to witness. Then Sawyer refolded the newspaper. Nolan disappeared down the hallway. Beckett sat in the chair by the window and stared out at the street. That evening, while Emmy and Ida were washing dishes, Ida spoke. "You know who those boys are," Ida said. "It was not a question. I know their name is Drummond, and they came from west of here, and one of them was hurt," Emmy said carefully. Ida looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that weighs a person and decides whether they are ready for what comes next. "I knew their father," Ida said. "Silas Drummond. Good man. Hard, though. The kind of hard that builds things but breaks the people building alongside him. He ran that ranch like a man who believed the mountain itself answered to him, and for a while it seemed like maybe it did." She dried a plate slowly. "Sawyer got the stubbornness," she said. "Nolan got the goodness. Beckett got both and never did figure out which one to lead with." "What did their father leave them?" Ida set the plate down and looked at Emmy with an expression that was equal parts warning and invitation. "One of the largest ranches in the territory," she said. 2,000 acres, spring-fed creek, grassland running clear to the timberline, good water, good soil. The kind of land men kill for in this part of the world and have." She paused. "Three boys sitting in my boarding house pretending to be broke," she said, "and they are likely the richest men in 3 counties. Emmy placed the dish she was holding very carefully on the counter. The information settled into her the way a final piece settles into a puzzle, not completing the picture she had been assembling, opening a new one larger and more complicated than she had imagined. And then Nolan walked into the kitchen. He had clearly been standing in the hallway long enough to hear what Ida had said, which meant he had chosen to enter rather than retreat, and that choice alone told Emmy something important. He looked at Ida, he looked at Emmy, and then he spoke the longest sentence she had ever heard him say. "Colton does not want the tax money," he said. His voice was quiet and measured, but there was something underneath it, a current of controlled anger that vibrated like a wire pulled tight. "He wants the land. I found a gold vein in the South Valley before Sawyer left. Never got to tell anyone because he was gone before I could." The kitchen was very quiet. "Gold," Beckett said, from the doorway where he had appeared with his usual talent for materializing at exactly the right moment. His grin was entirely absent. Not much, Nolan said. "Da-dum," but enough for Colton to want it. Sawyer came in behind Beckett, filling the last of the available space. 4 people and 3 Drummond brothers made the kitchen feel like a room that had been built for a different scale of human being entirely. "How long have you known?" Sawyer asked Nolan. His voice was even, but his eyes were not. "Since the spring before you left," Nolan said. "I found it while digging a new irrigation channel on the south slope. Quartz veins running through granite with visible flake. I was going to tell you. I was going to tell both of you. But you said what you said at the funeral, and then you were gone, and then it was just me and 2,000 acres and a bank that started asking questions I did not have the energy to answer alone." And then Emmy understood. Nolan had not wanted to sell the ranch because he did not love it. He had wanted to leave because he could not carry it alone. 2 years of running a 2,000-acre spread by himself. 2 years of mending fences and herding cattle and fighting off predators and dealing with the bank and watching the seasons change over land that was meant to be worked by 3 men, not 1. He was not angry about the land. He was angry about being left behind. And the anger was so deep and so justified that it had calcified into something that looked from the outside like indifference. Sawyer was quiet for a long time. His jaw worked. His hands resting on the back of a chair gripped the wood with the same controlled stillness, Emmy had seen when she cleaned his wound. I am going back, Sawyer said, to sign the papers, to face Colton, to settle this. Beckett nodded immediately. I am with you. Everyone looked at Nolan. No, Nolan said. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. I spent 2 years there alone, Nolan said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were burning. Fixing fences, herding cattle, fighting off wolves, dealing with the bank, while you two wandered wherever you pleased. Now you want to ride back and what? Pretend. Nothing happened. Nobody is pretending, Sawyer said. I am saying we go back and fix this. You cannot fix 2 years with one ride home, Nolan said. Beckett stepped between them, physically, both hands raised. All right, he said. We are not doing this here. But Nolan had already turned, the back door closed behind him. Not slammed, closed with a deliberateness that was somehow worse than slamming because it was controlled and chosen and final. The kitchen was quiet. Beckett looked at Sawyer. Sawyer looked at the door through which Nolan had disappeared. And Emmy stood at the counter with a dish towel in her hands, understanding for the first time the full shape of what was broken between these three men. She found Nolan on the back porch. He was sitting on the bottom step, elbows on his knees, staring into the darkness. The night was cold and clear, and the stars above the mountains were thick and bright in a way that city people never believe when you describe it to them. I am not here to convince you, Emmy said, standing in the doorway. I do not have the right. Silence. You know I came here because a man promised me a home, she said. He was not here when I arrived. No message, no explanation. I stood on that platform with 11 cents in a trunk and a letter that was not worth the paper it was written on. She sat down on the top step, keeping the distance. I'm not saying this to compare pain, she said, but I know what it feels like to be left behind. And I know that anger. It is justified. Every bit of it. Nolan looked up for the first time. In the faint light from the kitchen window, his amber eyes were not cold. They were tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. The tiredness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that he has forgotten what it felt like to set it down. But you can be angry and go back at the same time, Emmy said quietly. Those two things do not cancel each other out. Nolan looked at her for a long time, and then very slowly he nodded. Not agreement, but acknowledgement that she had said something worth sitting with for a while. Emmy stood and went back inside. She did not push further. She had said what she came to say it, and she trusted Nolan enough to believe that he would do with it whatever he decided to do. The next morning, all three brothers were in the yard before sunrise saddling horses. Nolan had not announced that he had changed his mind. He had simply appeared dressed and ready, standing beside his horse with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything. Sawyer looked at him across the yard and nodded once. A single motion that contained within it something too large for words. Beckett nearly laughed with relief, but caught himself converting it into a hard clap on Nolan's back. That was probably more painful than affectionate, but served its purpose. Emmy was in the kitchen when Sawyer came to the doorway. I will be back, he said. All right, I want to be back, he said. And then, as though he understood that this was an easy thing to say and a harder thing to mean, he added, I need you to know the difference. Emmy turned to look at him. He was already watching her. That quiet directness she had come to recognize as simply the way he was built. Not performance, not strategy, just honesty arriving without fanfare. Then come back, she said simply. He held her gaze for one more moment, and in that moment something passed between them that neither of them was ready to name, but both of them felt clearly enough that it did not need naming. It simply was. Beckett passed through next. Keep my coffee warm, Miss Pardo, he said. One eye closed in a wink that was pure Beckett, all charm and no weight, and then he was gone. Nolan was last. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at Emmy for exactly 1 second, and said a single word. Thanks. One word. But she heard what lived inside it. Gratitude not just for what she had said on the porch, but for the way she had said it. Without pity, without agenda. Just one person telling another person the truth and then stepping back to let them decide what to do with it. The front door closed. Boots crossed the porch. Saddle leather creaked. And then the sound of 3 horses moving west along the road, steady and unhurried, their hoofbeats falling into a rhythm that sounded, if you listened carefully, almost like a conversation. Emmy stood at the kitchen window and watched them go. Three tall figures on horseback, riding abreast, their silhouettes sharp and dark against the pale morning, singing. They did not look back. She watched until they crested the first ridge and disappeared over it, and the road was empty, and the town was quiet, and the mountains to the west stood enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the early light. She was going to miss him. Already before he had cleared the edge of town, she was going to miss Sawyer Drummond in a way that had no sensible explanation given how little time had passed and how little had actually been said between them. And she was going to miss Nolan's silence and Beckett's laughter and the way the three of them filled a room and made it feel like something more than four walls and a roof. She turned back to the stove and began making breakfast for a table that would have three fewer people at it this morning. Outside the window, the road stretched west toward the mountains. Empty now, but not, she thought, forever. They were gone for 14 days. Emmy did not count them deliberately. She simply noticed the way you notice weather, that the days had a different quality to them while the Drummond brothers were away. Not worse exactly, just quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise. The boarding house still had its sounds, the creak of floorboards under Mr. Aldridge's careful morning shuffle, the rattle of pots in the kitchen, the wind against the windows. But underneath all of it, there was an absence that sat like a held breath, and Emmy felt it most in the mornings when she made coffee for a table that was too empty, and in the evenings when the back porch felt larger than it had before. Ida noticed. She said nothing directly because Ida Calhoun had a talent for observing things and filing them away without comment that Emmy had come to appreciate deeply. But it was Ida who made sure there was always something that needed doing, a shelf to reorganize, a pantry to inventory, a quilt that needed mending. She kept Emmy's hands busy and the hours moving at a reasonable pace. And if she understood why this was necessary, she had the grace not to say so. On the third day, a letter arrived. Javes? It was brief, written in a hand that was bold and slightly uneven, the handwriting of a man more comfortable with a hammer than a pen. Emmy recognized it immediately as Beckett's, though she had never seen his writing before. Something about the energy of the letters on the page was unmistakably his. Still here. Ranch is worse than we thought. South fence line down for half a mile. Lost cattle scattered across two valleys. Sawyer has not slept. Nolan has not spoken. I am cooking. Pray for us all. Emmy read it twice, set it on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light could reach it, and went back to work. On the seventh day, a second letter came. This one was in a different hand, smaller, more controlled. Each letter formed with the deliberate precision of a man who chose his words on paper the same way he chose them in conversation. Sawyer's handwriting, still here, longer than expected. There are things that need to be said face to face that paper cannot hold. 2 lines. Emmy read them 3 times and understood that what was happening on that ranch 43 miles west of Flint Hollow was not about fences or cattle or bank documents. It was about 3 brothers sitting in the house where they grew up, in the rooms where their father had lived and their mother had died, trying to find a way back to each other across 2 years of silence and anger and grief. On the 10th day, no letter came. Emmy stood at the window longer than usual that evening, looking west, and told herself that no news was not necessarily bad news, and mostly believed it. On the 6th day of their absence, Ward Colton returned to Flint Hollow. He did not come to the boarding house this time. Emmy saw him from the kitchen window standing outside the saloon with Sheriff Horace Felt, the two of them deep in a conversation that involved Colton doing most of the talking and Felt doing most of the nodding. Felt was a man of approximately 50, built like a fence post that had been left in the weather too long, and he had the moral flexibility of a man who understood that his position depended on not making enemies of the people who had money. He was not corrupt exactly. He was simply a man who preferred the path of least resistance, and Ward Colton was very good at making sure that path led in his direction. Emmy watched them for several minutes. Then she went back to her work and said nothing about it to Ida, though she suspected Ida had seen the same thing from the front window and had drawn her own conclusions. On the 8th day, Leland Goss walked into the boarding house. Emmy was alone in the front parlor when the door opened and a man she had never met but recognized instantly stepped inside. He was younger than she had imagined from his letters, better dressed. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a way that did not last the good looks of a man who relied on first impressions and had never developed the substance to sustain a second one. His smile was quick and practiced, and it arrived on his face the way a hat arrives on a head, placed there for purpose rather than warmth. Miss Pardo, he said, as though they were old friends, as though he had not vanished from her life before it had begun. He told her he had been called away on urgent business, a land deal that could not wait. He was sorry, truly sorry for the misunderstanding, but he was back now, and his offer still stood. He had a house, he said, a small spread outside of town, a future that was stable and respectable and waiting for her if she wanted it. He said all of this standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his smile fixed in place, and Emmy listened to every word with the careful attention she gave to everything, and when he was finished, she looked at him. This man whose letter she had read until the paper went soft, this man she had crossed half a continent to meet, this man whose name she had whispered to herself on cold nights in an empty house in Missouri as though it were a prayer. She waited for anger or relief or the satisfaction of a question finally answered. None of it came. What she felt instead was the clear, cool recognition that she was no longer the woman who had boarded that train. She had changed, and the woman she had become wanted something different from what Leland Goss was offering, something she could not quite name yet, but knew with absolute certainty did not live behind his practiced smile. I appreciate the offer, she said, but I will have to decline. Leland Goss looked confused, then annoyed, then polite. Then he left and the door closed behind him, and the room was quiet again in a way that felt like an exhale. Ida appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had clearly been listening because Ida always listened, and the expression on her face was the closest thing to open pride that Emmy had ever seen on it, disguised just barely beneath her habitual frown. Neither of them said a word about it. Neither of them needed to. On the 11th day, Ward Colton came to the boarding house. He came with Sheriff Feld, and he came with papers, and this time he was not smiling. The documents were a temporary seizure order signed by a circuit judge whose name Emmy did not recognize, authorizing the bank to place a lien on the Drummond property if the registered owners did not appear to confirm their claim within 10 days. 10 days, Colton said, laying the papers on Ida's counter with the careful placement of a man who understood the power of paperwork. If those boys are not back before the deadline, the land is sealed, and I have a buyer who will not wait past January. He also mentioned almost casually that harboring debtors who were evading their financial obligations was itself a matter of some legal concern, and that he would hate for a respectable establishment like Ida's boarding house to become entangled in something unpleasant. Ida told him to get out of her house. She used language that Emmy had not previously heard from her, and that she suspected Ida had been saving for a special occasion. After Colton and Felt left, Emmy stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at the papers on the counter and thinking. Then she made a decision. She was going to ride to the Drummond Ranch, 43 miles west into the mountains on roads she did not know, through country she had never seen, to deliver a message that could not wait for a letter to carry it. Ida opposed this immediately and with considerable force. You do not know the way, she said. You barely know how to ride. The weather could turn. There are men on that road who would not think twice about a woman alone. I will find the way, Emmy said. And Ida looked at her then with an expression that Emmy would remember for the rest of her life. It was not concern for her safety, though that was part of it. It was the recognition of something. The look of a woman seeing in another woman the same reckless, stubborn, bone-deep determination that had defined her own youth, and knowing that no amount of argument would change the mind of a person who had already decided to do the thing that scared her most. Ida gave her a horse. She gave her directions obtained from a freight driver who knew the mountain roads. She gave her a wrapped bundle of food and a blanket and a stern instruction to stay on the main trail and not stop after dark. And early on the morning of the 12th day, Emmeline Pardo climbed onto a borrowed horse and rode west. She rode for a day and a half. The trail climbed steadily through pine forest that grew denser and taller the further west she went, the trees closing in overhead until the sky was visible only in narrow strips of blue between the branches. The air grew colder as she gained elevation. The silence grew larger. By the afternoon of the first day, she had not seen another human being in 4 hours, and the only sounds were the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on packed earth, the creak of saddle leather and the wind moving through the pines, with a sound that was not quite a whisper and not quite a song, but something ancient and continuous that made her feel very small and very present at the same time. She slept for a few hours beside the trail, wrapped in Ida's blanket, with the horse tied nearby, and the stars above her so thick and bright that they seemed almost aggressive, as though the sky were showing off. She was cold and sore, and more frightened than she would have admitted to anyone. But she was also in some ways she could not fully articulate more alive than she had been in months, perhaps years. The fear and the purpose and the vast indifferent beauty of the mountains had burned away everything that was not essential, and what was left was simply Emmy, moving towards something she believed in. Alone and all right with being alone, because being alone was not the same as being lost. She reached the Drummond Ranch in the late afternoon of the second day, and when she crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley below, she understood for the first time why Sawyer had described it the way he had. The ranch spread out below her in the golden light of a mountain afternoon, and it was enormous. Not just large, but vast in the way that only Western land can be vast, stretching from the timbered slopes on one side to open grassland on the other, with a creek running through the valley floor that caught the late sunlight and turned it into long silver lines that wound between the pastures like threads of mercury. The main house was larger than she had imagined, a solid log structure with a stone chimney and a wide porch, but it showed the wear of 2 years without enough hands to maintain it. The roof sagged slightly on one side. A section of the porch railing was missing. The barn to the east was standing but listing, and the fences visible from the ridge were in various states of collapse. It was beautiful, and it was broken. And somehow both of those things together made it more beautiful, not less, because it looked like a place that was waiting to be loved back to life. Beckett saw her first. He was repairing a fence post near the creek when he looked up and saw a small figure on horseback silhouetted against the sky on the eastern ridge. Honey blonde hair catching the afternoon light, a navy blue dress that had no business being on a horse in the Montana mountains. He stood very still for approximately 2 seconds, which was possibly the longest Beckett Drummond had ever been still in his life. Then he dropped his hammer and ran toward the house, his voice carrying across the valley with a clarity that startled birds out of the trees along the creek. "Sawyer, Nolan, you need to come out here." Sawyer emerged from the cabin, first pushing through the door, with one hand the other still holding a piece of harness leather he had been mending. His shirt sleeves were rolled past his elbows, and there was mud on his forearms, and his jaw was unshaved, and he looked tired, like a man who had been working from before dawn and had no intention of stopping before dark. He looked up the ridge, and he went very still. Nolan came out behind him and stood at his shoulder, and for a moment the two of them simply watched as Emmy guided the borrowed horse carefully down the slope toward the valley floor, picking her way along a trail that was barely a trail at all. She rode into the yard and dismounted with more determination than grace, her legs stiff from 30 hours of riding and her dress carrying 43 miles of mountain dust. Her hair had come loose from its pins hours ago and hung around her face in tangled waves. Her cheeks were wind-burned pink, and her hands were raw from the rains, and she was breathing harder than she wanted to be. She looked at Sawyer. He looked at her. "Colton has a temporary seizure order," she said, her voice steady despite everything. 10 days, you have to come back." And then, because she was Emmy Pardo, and she was not the kind of person who stopped at facts when feelings needed saying, she added, "And I miss the coffee in the mornings." Beckett laughed, a real laugh, the first one she had heard from him, that was not a shield or a strategy or a performance, but simply the involuntary sound of a man experiencing genuine delight. Nolan looked at Sawyer, and on Sawyer's face, Emmy saw something she had never seen before. A complete smile. Not the place where a smile lived when it was not being used, but the smile itself, full and unguarded and real. "You rode 43 miles, he said. "I counted," she said. That night, the four of them sat around the table in the old Drummond cabin. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the wind pressed against the log walls, and the lamplight made the room feel smaller and warmer and older than it was. Beckett had cooked, which meant the stew was enthusiastic rather than skilled, but no one complained. Nolan ate in his customary silence, but Emmy noticed that his shoulders were lower than she had ever seen them, as though some of the tension he carried had finally begun to ease. And Sawyer sat at the head of the table in the chair that had been his father's, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. They told her about the 2 weeks, not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough that she could understand the shape of what had happened. Sawyer and Nolan had talked, really talked for the first time in 2 years, sitting in the cabin, where they had grown up surrounded by the things their father had built and their mother had loved, and that both of them had been running from in different directions. Nolan had said the thing that needed saying. You left because you were afraid. Afraid that if you stayed, you would become him. And he was too hard on all of us. Sawyer had not denied it. They had sat with that truth between them for a long time, and it had been terrible and necessary, and nothing close to easy. And then one evening, Nolan had taken out his harmonica and played a song their mother used to sing, a melody none of them had heard in 2 years. Sawyer had turned away. Beckett had not bothered to hide his tears. And something in that music, something in the simple act of a shared memory recalled, through sound had begun to mend what words alone could not. It was not fixed. Emmy understood that. You do not repair 2 years of silence in 2 weeks. But the three brothers sitting around that table were no longer the same three men who had ridden west from Flint Hollow 14 days ago. Something had shifted between them, something fundamental and fragile and worth protecting. Emmy looked around the table at these three men, the steady one, the quiet one, the wild one. Three brothers carved from the same mountain, broken apart by grief and pride, and the terrible weight of things said at a graveside that could never be unsaid, and now slowly, painfully finding their way back to each other. She looked at the cabin around her, the solid log walls, the stone fireplace, the kitchen that needed attention, and the porch that needed rebuilding, and the windows that looked out over a valley that went on forever. And she realized sitting there in the lamplight with Stu she did not mind, was burnt in company. She did not want to leave, that she was sitting exactly where she wanted to be. They rode back to Flint Hollow together. 2 days on the trail, four abreast when the road was wide enough. Sawyer in front, Nolan behind Beckett, in the middle beside Emmy, the formation falling into place without discussion, in the way that things fall into place between people who have begun to trust each other with something more than words. On the trail, Beckett told Emmy about their childhood. Three brothers born identical, so alike as babies, that their mother, who had died when they were 10, had tied different colored ribbons around each of their wrists to tell them apart. Sawyer always cut his, he said, laughing. Wanted to be any one of the three of us on any given day. Nolan kept his, and I swallowed mine the first time and had to see the doctor. Emmy laughed at that, a real laugh, and realized it was the first time she had laughed like that since arriving in Montana. When they stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing, Nolan walked over to where Emmy was standing and spoke. It was only the second time he had initiated conversation with her, and she gave him her full attention. That night on the porch, he said, "What you said about being angry and going back at the same time. I have been thinking about that every day since. And you were right. But the hard part is not going back. The hard part is forgiving once you get there." He glanced at Sawyer, who was checking the sole cinches on the barch side of the creek. "I am working on that part." They arrived to find Ward Colton waiting. The confrontation happened in Sheriff Felt's office, which was a generous name for a room with a desk and 2 chairs and a gun rack and the lingering smell of pipe tobacco. Colton was there with his papers and his flat gray eyes and his smile that never reached them. Felt stood behind his desk looking like a man who wanted to be anywhere else. Sawyer spoke first. His voice was level and unhurried, the same way it always was, and he laid out the situation with the precision of a man who had been thinking about this for a long time. The three Drummond brothers would sign a joint confirmation of ownership. They would pay the 3 years of back taxes using proceeds from cattle sales. The seizure order would be rescinded. Colton objected. The land had been neglected, he said. The bank had grounds to refuse reconfirmation. And then Nolan spoke. "I did not neglect that land," he said. And his voice, the voice that Emmy had heard say fewer words in 6 weeks than most men said in an afternoon, was steady and clear and carried the weight of 2 years of solitary labor behind every syllable. "I was there every day for 2 years. I have ledgers documenting every head of cattle, every mile of fence line, every expense. The entire territory west of here knows I did not leave that ranch for a single day." Colton's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough, and then Beckett stepped forward. He had been doing something during those weeks in Flint Hollow that none of them had fully understood. While his grin had been charming everyone from Ida to Mr. Aldridge, while his warmth had been filling rooms and drawing attention, Beckett Drummond had been quietly, methodically gathering information, talking to people, asking questions that did not seem like questions, piecing together a picture that he now laid out with a clarity that surprised everyone except perhaps Nolan, who had always known that his youngest brother's ease with people was not merely social but strategic. Colton had arranged for Leland Goss to write letters to single women in other states, not just Emmy, at least three others over the past 2 years. Women with no family and no resources lured west with promises of marriage that were never intended to be kept. The purpose was to create a supply of stranded dependent labor for businesses that Colton controlled or influenced in towns across the territory. It was not illegal in any way that the law of 1878 could easily address, but it was calculated and it was cruel. And when Beckett laid it all out in that small office, the moral weight of it filled the room like smoke. Emmy stood near the back wall. She heard it all. She did not cry. She did not tremble. But her hand found the fabric of her skirt and gripped it, and Ida, standing beside her, placed one broad, strong hand on her shoulder without a word. The letter, the promises, the train ticket, the empty platform. All of it had been a mechanism, a system. And she, Emmeline Pardoe of Missouri, who had crossed half a continent, believing in love she had read on a page, had been a line item in a ledger kept by a man with gray eyes and a smile that never once reached them. Sheriff Felt asked Colton to leave town. His voice was not strong, but it was final, because even a man of flexible morals has a line, and Horace Felt had apparently found his. Colton looked around the room, at Felt behind his desk, at the three Drummond brothers standing shoulder to shoulder, each of them over 6 feet tall, their combined presence filling the office like a wall of mountain granite. At Emmy, small and still and burning with the quiet fury that did not need to be loud to be felt. He left. He did not come back. In the weeks that followed, things settled. Not dramatically, not in a single moment of revelation or transformation. They settled the way true things settle. Gradually and then all at once, and only recognizable in retrospect as the inevitable shape they had always been moving toward. The three brothers agreed on a division of labor for the ranch. Sawyer would manage the operations, the daily work of running a 2,000-acre spread that required decisions to be made before dawn and not second-guessed after dark. Nolan would handle the finances, the ledgers and the accounts, and the careful tracking of every dollar in and every dollar out, because he had been doing it alone for 2 years, and he was better at it than either of his brothers, and they all knew it. Beckett would manage trade and dealings with the outside world, buying and selling cattle, and negotiating with merchants and representing the Drummond name in every town within riding distance, because no one sold anything better than a man who could make a stranger feel like a friend in under 5 minutes. It was not what any single one of them would have chosen, but it was fair, and it was honest, and it was done. Sawyer told Emmy the truth about the ranch one evening in the kitchen after supper, when the house was quiet and the fire was low, and the light from the single lamp made the room feel like the only room in the world. "The South Range I kept," he said. "It is not a small piece of land. The ranch my family built, what I walked away from it, is one of the largest spreads in this part of the territory." He said it plainly, the way he said everything that mattered. "I was not hiding it from you to deceive you. I was hiding it from everyone because I did not want it to be the first thing people saw when they looked at me." He paused. "It usually is." And then he said, "It did not feel like the most important thing about me. Not here, not with you." Emmy looked at him for a long time, at the tired, careful, quietly honest face of a man who had spent 2 years making himself invisible. And then somehow, in a borrowed room in a town he had only passed through by accident, had let himself be seen. "It is not," she said finally, "the most important thing." Something in his expression eased. Not dramatically, just the way a man's shoulders come down when he sets something heavy on the ground after carrying it longer than he should have. Nolan spoke to Emmy before the proposal came in his own way, which was brief and precise and left nothing to interpretation. "You are good for my brother," he said, "and you are good for the ranch. But more than that, you are good for all three of us, because you are the first person to walk into our lives who did not care how many acres we owned." Beckett's version was different in delivery, but identical in substance. He found her in the kitchen one morning and wrapped her in a hug that was careful enough to suggest Sawyer was watching from somewhere nearby. "Welcome to the family, Miss Pardoe," he said. "Or it will be Drummond soon enough, I suspect. Either way, you are stuck with us now." He asked her to walk with him on a Saturday morning in late November, when the air had gone sharp and clean, and the cottonwood trees along the edge of town had dropped the last of their leaves. They walked without any destination in particular, which was itself a kind of answer to a question neither of them had formally asked. "I have been thinking about what it would take to make the ranch a real home again," he said. "Not just land, a home. And I cannot quite picture it without picturing you in it. That is either the most practical proposal I have ever heard," Emmy said, "or the most romantic one. Which would you prefer it to be?" "Both," she said. At the same time, he stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her fully. And when he reached out and took her hand from inside her sleeve carefully, as though he understood that some things needed to be held gently in the beginning, she let him. "Then both it is," he said. They were married on the 15th of December, 1878, in the small church at the edge of Flint Hollow. Ida Calhoun stood as witness with her chin lifted and her eyes bright, and her habitual frown softened into something that anyone who did not know her might have mistaken for a smile. Mr. Aldridge sat in the second pew looking quietly pleased with himself for reasons nobody entirely understood. Nolan stood to Sawyer's right, his back straight, his face solemn, his amber eyes steady and clear. Beckett stood to his left, grinning so widely that the minister looked at him twice. That night, Sawyer closed the cabin door softly behind them. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the Drummond Ranch in white, filling the valley with a silence that was not empty but full of everything that had brought them here, and everything that was about to begin. When morning came, the world outside the window looked entirely new. Spring arrived the way spring arrives in the mountains. Slowly at first, and then all at once, the snow retreating up the slopes day by day until the valley floor was green and the creek was running high and fast with meltwater that caught the morning light in long silver lines. Emmy stood on the ridge that Sawyer had described, the one on the eastern boundary of the South Range where 4 counties were visible on a clear day. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of morning that makes the world look newly arrived. Sawyer stood beside her with his hand resting at the small of her back. Below them, the ranch spread out again and unhurried in every direction. It looked exactly as he had described it, and it looked like a place where things could last. The months that followed were full in the way that frontier life is full, with work that never ended, and weather that never cooperated, and small victories that mattered more than they would have anywhere else. The 3 brothers rebuilt the ranch together. Sawyer and Beckett raised the barn that had been listing for 2 years, working from dawn until the light failed. Nolan kept the books and managed the money with the precise, methodical attention to detail that had kept the place alive during the 2 years he had been alone. Emmy learned to ride properly, taught by Beckett with his patient humor. She learned to shoot, taught by Nolan with a quietness that turned out to be the best kind of teaching. She learned to read the weather on the mountain, taught by Sawyer with as few words as possible, which was the only way Sawyer taught anything. The neighbors came. Word had spread about the woman who had ridden 43 miles alone to warn the Drummonds, and that story, simple and true, opened on doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Ranch wives brought bread and preserves. Men offered help with fencing. The community that had watched the Drummond brothers fracture 2 years ago now watched them come back together, and there is something in the human heart that responds to that kind of story, the story of broken things being mended by stubborn love and honest work. The first winter together was the hardest. A blizzard came in January that was the worst in 20 years, and it took 30 head of cattle and a section of the new fence, and very nearly took Nolan, who broke his arm pulling a horse from a frozen creek. Emmy kept the books during his recovery, and she cooked for 4, and she bandaged Nolan's arm with the same steady hands that had bandaged Sawyer's wound in a boarding house room that now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. One evening during the worst of the storm, when the wind was screaming and the cabin walls were groaning and the world outside the windows was nothing but white, Sawyer looked at her across the kitchen table and said the only words he said all week. "You belong here, Beausoir." He did not say it like a compliment. He said it like a fact, like something he had known for a while and had finally allowed himself to say out loud. By the following December, the ranch house had a new porch. It faced the morning sun, just as a letter had once promised, though the man who had written that letter was long gone, and the porch had been built by different hands entirely. Hands that were calloused and scarred, and strong hands that had built things and broken things and learned eventually that building was better. In the small room off the kitchen, the room that Sawyer had spent an entire month constructing, With the determination of a man who understood now what he was building it for, there was a cradle, handmade from cottonwood, with a child in it who had Sawyer's dark hair and Emmy's blue eyes, and the habit already visible at just a few weeks old of watching everything quietly and carefully as though the world were a place full of things worth understanding. Beckett was the first to make the baby laugh. Nolan carved a small wooden horse and left it beside the cradle without telling anyone, though everyone knew. And Sawyer held his son with hands so large the child fit in one palm, and Emmy saw in his face something she had never seen before. A softness that was not afraid of being witnessed. 20 years later, the Drummond Ranch was the largest operation in 3 counties. Sawyer's hair had gone silver at the temples, and his step was slower than it had been, but his back was still straight, and his word was still iron, and his hands still rested at the small of Emmy's back every evening when they stood on the porch and watched the sun go down. Nolan had married a schoolteacher who had arrived in Flint Hollow to find that no one had come to meet her at the station, a circumstance that made Emmy laugh when she heard it and say, "It is a family tradition." Beckett had 3 children of his own, all of whom had inherited his grin and his voice and his absolute inability to be quiet for more than 30 seconds at a stretch. Ida still came to visit once a month. She brought bread that Emmy always said she did not need to bring, and Ida always said she knew. On an evening in the autumn of 1898, Emmy sat on the porch that Sawyer had built and watched her grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers at the edge of the south pasture. The mountains rose beyond them, the same mountains that had been there when she arrived 20 years ago, with nothing, and they would be there long after she was gone. The creek caught the last of the daylight and turned it to silver. The cottonwood trees along the ridge were going gold. She still remembered stepping off that train into nothing. She remembered the 11 cents. She remembered the letters soft at the folds with promises that had turned out to be lies, wrapped in a stranger's handwriting. She remembered standing on that platform alone, 22 years old, watching the train pull away and thinking that her future had vanished before she had ever arrived to claim it. She had been wrong about that. Her future had not vanished. It had simply been waiting for her somewhere she had not thought to look. In a boarding house kitchen, in a wound that needed tending, in a man who spoke carefully and loved quietly and had been hiding not from the world, but from the part of himself that was afraid to need anyone. In his brothers, one silent and one loud, who had taught her that family is not only the people you are born to, but the people you choose to stay with when staying is hard. The letter had promised a house. She had gotten one, but not the house in the letter. This one was built from cottonwood and pine and Montana granite. Built from winters survived and fences mended and arguments settled and a love that had arrived without announcement and stayed without condition. Built by a man whose hands shook the first time he held his son, but never once shook when he held her. Sawyer came out onto the porch and sat beside her. He did not speak. He did not need to. After 20 years, they had learned each other's silences the way they had learned everything else, by living through them together. The last light went gold over the mountains. The children's laughter carried up from the pasture. And Emmeline Drummond, who had once been Emmeline Pardo of Missouri, who had once stood on a wooden platform at the end of the world with nothing but a trunk and a broken promise, sat beside her husband on the porch he had built with his own hands and watched the day end over the life they had made together. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.